Let's break down the US national debt, a topic that's often in the headlines but rarely explained in simple terms. What does it really mean when people say America owes trillions of dollars? And why does it matter to you and me? Think of it as America's ever-growing credit card bill. Just like a household that spends more than it earns, the US government has to borrow money to cover the gap between what it brings in and what it spends. Every year, the government spends more than it collects in taxes, so it borrows the rest. This happens year after year, and each time, the borrowed amount adds up. That yearly shortfall is called the deficit. The national debt is the total of all those deficits added together over decades. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger every year. As of June 2025, the debt is about $35 trillion. A number so huge it's hard to even imagine. That's more than the entire US economy produces in a year, and it keeps growing. So, how does the government borrow all this money? It sells treasury securities, bonds, bills, and notes. These are basically IOUs that promise to pay back the money with interest. People, companies, and even foreign governments buy them, lending money to the US. These US treasuries are considered some of the safest investments in the world, so there's always demand. Investors trust the US government to pay them back, which keeps the borrowing machine running. But the debt isn't just a number on a screen. It means real money, billions of dollars every year, goes to pay interest. That's money that could be used for building roads, improving schools, or funding scientific research. Instead, a growing chunk of the federal budget is spent just on interest payments, not on reducing the debt itself. The more we owe, the more we pay, leaving less for everything else. It's like working overtime just to pay the minimum on your credit card, never touching the principal. The debt remains and the interest keeps piling up, making it harder to get ahead. That's the national debt, a massive, ever-growing tab that shapes our economy, influences government decisions, and impacts the future for all Americans. Understanding it is the first step to knowing why it matters for you, your family, and the country as a whole. $35 trillion is a number so big, it's almost meaningless. It's a figure that's hard to wrap your head around, so enormous that it can feel more like science fiction than reality. When we hear numbers this large, our brains tend to shut down, unable to truly grasp what they represent. To put it in perspective, if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you nearly 2,740 years to spend just $1 trillion. That's longer than the entire history of written language, longer than the rise and fall of most civilizations. For $35 trillion, you'd have to start spending back in the Stone Age, before the first cities, before the first empires, before the wheel was even invented. Imagine someone starting to spend $1 million a day when humans were still making tools out of stone, and they'd still be spending today. Or, if you prefer real estate, you could buy every single home in America twice and still have billions left over. That's every house, apartment, and condo from coast to coast bought and paid for, not once, but 2 times. Here's another way to look at it. 1 trillion seconds is over 31,000 years. 35 trillion seconds ago, Neanderthals were still roaming the earth, and modern humans hadn't even painted their first cave wall. That's how far back in time you'd have to go to count to 35 trillion, 1 second at a time. So when politicians talk about cutting $1 billion here or there, it's like bailing out the Titanic with a teaspoon. The scale of the problem is so vast that small cuts barely make a ripple in the ocean of debt. The point is, these numbers are so huge, it's easy to tune out, to feel overwhelmed or even numb. But ignoring them doesn't make them go away. The debt is real, and it's growing by about $1 trillion every 100 days. That's $10 billion every single day, piling up faster than most of us can imagine. So when you hear about budget cuts, remember the scale we're dealing with. Cutting a few billion is like trimming a single leaf from a giant redwood tree. It barely changes the picture. We're not talking about a leaky faucet. This is a fire hose that's been left on for decades, flooding the system with more and more debt every year. Understanding the scale is the first step to understanding the problem. Only by truly grasping how massive these numbers are, can we begin to have a real conversation about solutions. The debt isn't just big, it's almost unimaginably big. It stretches beyond our everyday experience, challenging us to think bigger and to take the issue seriously. When we talk about the massive US national debt, have you ever wondered who actually holds all this money? Who do we really owe? The answer is more complex than you might think, and it's not just foreign countries or mysterious investors, In fact, the debt is split into two main categories, each with its own story and impact on our economy. The two main types of U.S. government debt are called public debt and intragovernmental debt. Understanding the difference between them is key to understanding who's really on the hook for America's borrowing. First, let's look at public debt. This is the largest portion, about $28 trillion. It's held by a wide range of people and organizations. Everyday Americans, corporations, pension funds, mutual funds, banks, the Federal Reserve, and even foreign governments like Japan and China. When you hear about the U.S. borrowing money, this is where most of it goes. Despite what you might hear, most of this public debt is actually owned by Americans themselves, through things like savings bonds, retirement accounts, and investment funds. So, in a sense, the government is borrowing from its own citizens, not just from overseas. This means that a huge chunk of the national debt is money the government owes to its own people and institutions. When the government pays interest on this debt, it's often going right back into the pockets of Americans, supporting their savings and retirement. The second type is intragovernmental debt. This is money that one part of the government owes to another. The biggest example? The Treasury owing money to the Social Security Trust Fund. Here's how it works. Social Security often collects more in taxes than it pays out in benefits. The surplus is invested in special Treasury bonds, which are essentially IOUs from the government to itself. This helps fund future Social Security payments. Right now, this intragovernmental debt adds up to about $7 trillion, roughly a fifth of the total national debt. Some people argue that this kind of debt doesn't count, because it's just the government owing itself. But in reality, it represents a very real promise to future retirees, money that millions of Americans are counting on for their financial security. If the government ever failed to pay back this debt, it would be a disaster for seniors and families who depend on Social Security. The consequences would ripple through the entire economy. So both types of debt matter. Public debt is owed to investors, both at home and abroad, while intragovernmental debt is owed to programs that millions of Americans rely on every day. The bottom line? The U.S. owes money not just to the world, but also to itself and its own people. Understanding who holds the debt helps us see why managing it responsibly is so important for everyone's future. Why does the debt keep ballooning? It's not just one thing, it's a perfect storm. The government spends more than it takes in year after year, no matter who's in charge. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, grows automatically as more people qualify, especially as the population ages. Healthcare costs keep rising, making these programs even more expensive. Interest payments on the debt are huge and getting bigger, especially as interest rates rise. The more we borrow, the more we pay in interest, which means we have to borrow even more, a vicious cycle. Major crises, like the 2008 financial crash, wars, and the COVID-19 pandemic, add trillions in emergency spending. Both parties contribute tax cuts without spending cuts or new programs without new taxes, all add to the debt. The result? A debt snowball that keeps rolling, picking up speed and size. It's a system built to borrow and it's running on autopilot. Why are experts so worried? 3 big reasons. First, interest payments are exploding. Over $870 billion a year, more than the defense budget. That's money we can't use for anything else. Second, the debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. We owe more than our entire economy produces in a year. High debt to GDP makes investors nervous and can signal trouble ahead. Third, if investors lose confidence in America's ability to pay, they'll demand higher interest rates or stop buying our bonds. That could trigger a vicious cycle. Higher rates make debt payments even bigger, which scares investors more, and so on. It's a financial death spiral. The U.S. has always been seen as the safest bet in the world, but that trust isn't guaranteed forever. If we lose it, borrowing gets much more expensive, fast. The real fear isn't just the size of the debt, it's what happens if the world stops believing we'll pay it back. That's when a chronic problem becomes a crisis, and that's why people are freaking out. So why hasn't the U.S. collapsed under this mountain of debt? America has 2 economic superpowers. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, and the U.S. borrows in its own money. The world needs dollars for trade, so there's always demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. This lets us borrow huge sums at lower interest rates than almost anyone else. Plus, the U.S. can print dollars if needed, something most countries can't do. That doesn't mean we can print our way out of trouble forever. Too much printing leads to inflation and erodes trust. But these superpowers give the US a financial safety net that other countries envy. That's why the debt crisis hasn't hit, yet. Even superpowers have limits. So when does debt become a true crisis? The first warning sign: interest payments get so big they force impossible choices, like slashing Social Security or doubling taxes. If investors sense the US can't or won't pay, they'll demand higher rates or stop lending, triggering a spiral. Another risk: losing the dollar's reserve currency status. If global demand for dollars drops, borrowing gets much harder. Or, the debt to GDP ratio could simply get so high that markets panic. There's no magic number, but confidence can evaporate fast. The party ends when trust in America's finances runs out, and that's a risk we can't ignore. How do we fix the debt? There are four main options, and none are easy. First, cut spending, especially on big programs like Social Security and Medicare, but that's politically toxic. Second, raise taxes on individuals, corporations, or both. Also wildly unpopular. Third, try to grow the economy faster than the debt. Great in theory, but hard to pull off at the scale we need. Fourth, reform programs to make them more efficient, but that usually means some mix of cuts and tax hikes anyway. Realistically, any solution will require a painful combination of all these. That's why politicians avoid the issue. It's a political minefield. But the math is simple. We can't borrow forever. The longer we wait, the harder the fix becomes. Sooner or later, we'll have to make tough choices. The US debt isn't a distant threat, it's a present-day problem. We're already spending more on interest than on defense, draining resources from the future. The real danger is losing the world's trust in our ability to pay. There's no easy fix, only tough choices and shared sacrifice. We need compromise and long-term thinking, not political games. The debt reflects decades of wanting it all: low taxes, high spending, and no hard decisions. The bill is coming due, and the longer we wait, the worse it gets. The crisis comes when we lose control of our own future. It's up to us to change course before the choice is made for us.